So in the last lecture, what we did is we looked at the exchange of oxygen. We looked at how oxygen is exchanged between the air and the alveoli and the blood and the pulmonary capillaries. And we looked at how oxygen is exchanged between the blood in the systemic capillaries and ultimately the kind of the tissues of the body into the interstitial fluid around the tissues. Now what we need to do is look at carbon dioxide, because that's the other gas that's discussed when you talk about gas exchange. And what we're going to do is we're going to start off by looking at how CO2 is exchanged between the cells of the body and the blood that exists within the systemic capillaries. So here we will draw a systemic capillary. Here are some muscle cells. All right. What's going through this systemic capillary, what we'll say, is, first of all, oxygenated blood. Okay. Oxygenated blood has CO2 located within its blood plasma. Okay. Within the blood plasma of oxygenated blood, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is about 40 millimeters of mercury. One more time. Within the blood plasma of oxygenated blood, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is about 40 millimeters of mercury. And this is the blood that's traveling through this capillary past these muscle cells. Okay. Now, inside of the interstitial fluid, or within the interstitial fluid, the fluid that exists around the muscle cells, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is about 46 millimeters of mercury. So there's a partial pressure gradient for carbon dioxide. Okay. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the interstitial fluid around the muscle cells, or whatever tissue this is in the human body, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the interstitial fluid is about 46 millimeters of mercury. The blood that exists in the systemic capillary going past this tissue, right, the oxygenated blood, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within its blood plasma is 40 millimeters of mercury. Okay, let's first talk about why the partial pressure of carbon dioxide would be greater in the interstitial fluid around the tissues than it would be in the blood plasma within this systemic capillary. This is oxygenated blood. Well, what are the muscle cells always doing? They're always producing ATP, right? They're always making ATP to meet their ATP demands. And what do you produce in the process of creating ATP? Well, the cells are constantly producing carbon dioxide, right? The cells are constantly making CO2 as they're creating ATP through oxidative phosphorylation. It's a byproduct, CO2, of making ATP via oxidative phosphorylation. There's no way around it. So the cells of the body are constantly creating CO2. And where's the CO2? What's it doing? It's leaking out. It travels out into the interstitial fluid. So there's constantly CO2 moving out into the interstitial fluid, driving up the amount of CO2 within the interstitial fluid, and thus the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the interstitial fluid. And exactly why the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, exactly where these numbers come from. Like, where does why is the interstitial fluid 46 millimeters of mercury, and why is the blood plasma within oxygenated blood, why does it have a partial pressure of carbon dioxide of 40? That we can kind of address when we actually get to the lungs. But for now, I just wanted to establish where this carbon dioxide is actually coming from. First of all, in the interstitial fluid, right? It's coming from the cells that exist around the interstitial fluid. The cells are constantly producing CO2, which is moving into the interstitial fluid and driving up the amount of CO2 in the interstitial fluid, and thus the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the interstitial fluid is constantly rising. Okay, big point here is we have a partial pressure gradient in terms of carbon dioxide between the interstitial fluid and the blood plasma within this systemic capillary. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the interstitial fluid is 46. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma that's in this systemic capillary, that's part of the oxygenated blood, is 40. Okay, so we know the direction that carbon dioxide wants to go. It wants to travel from the interstitial fluid into the blood plasma that's in the systemic capillary. And that's exactly what it's going to do. But we have to take a look at how exactly that is going to happen and why. So, again, we have this systemic capillary, which is actually going to start off carrying oxygenated blood past the tissues here. Here's the tissue, which in our case is muscle tissue. So these are the muscle cells. And what are the muscle cells producing? Well, they're producing carbon dioxide, CO2, through the process of making ATP via oxidative phosphorylation, mostly from the Krebs cycle. And the CO2, as it's made, is going to do what? It's going to diffuse from inside of the cell to outside of the cell, and that's going to cause the interstitial fluid around the muscle cells to be around, in our case, 46 millimeters of mercury. Now, in the blood, specifically the blood plasma, that's in this systemic capillary, going past this muscle tissue, in the blood plasma, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 40 millimeters of mercury. So clearly, carbon dioxide is going to want to go from the interstitial fluid into the blood plasma within the oxygenated blood so that it can actually then become deoxygenated blood. In the last lecture, we looked at, part of the process as to how blood becomes deoxygenated. One of the things that happens is it loses oxygen to the tissue, but the other thing that happens is through the deoxygenation process, the blood is also going to gain carbon dioxide. So how exactly does that happen? Well, carbon dioxide is going to follow its partial pressure gradient. Carbon dioxide is going to want to move from the interstitial fluid into the blood plasma. It wants to move from high to low, right? It wants to move from 46 towards 40 millimeters of mercury. The first thing that you have to understand to really comprehend what's happening here is as the carbon dioxide goes from the interstitial fluid into the blood plasma, you really kind of have to, you don't have to pretend, because this more or less happens, is that the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the interstitial fluid is more or less static, okay? Because as soon as the carbon dioxide leaves the interstitial fluid and goes into the blood plasma, it just gets replaced with more carbon dioxide that's coming from the tissues, in this case the muscle cells that exist around it. Meaning, again, as soon as some of this CO2 goes from the interstitial fluid into the blood plasma, right, that's within this systemic capillary, yes, some of the carbon dioxide would be lost. So you would think, okay, there would be a transient decrease in the amount of carbon dioxide within the interstitial fluid. Yeah, but not really, because as soon as that CO2 leaves, it just immediately gets replaced with more CO2 that's coming from the cells which are producing it. So for the sake of making things easier, and for more or less for the sake of how things truly happen, you can just assume that the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the interstitial fluid, it doesn't really decrease. It pretty much just stays at 46 at all times. So considering those facts, what do we think is actually going to happen? Well, as oxygenated blood within this systemic capillary goes past the tissues, in this case muscle tissue, it's going to interact with interstitial fluid that has a partial pressure of carbon dioxide that is 46 millimeters of mercury. And within the oxygenated blood itself, the blood plasma has a partial pressure of carbon dioxide of 40. So carbon dioxide is going to move from the interstitial fluid into the plasma. Right? The carbon dioxide is going to follow its partial pressure gradient. It's going to move from the interstitial fluid, where the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 46, into the blood plasma of this oxygenated blood, where the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 40. And very, very quickly, as the blood is traveling past this tissue, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma will rise to 46. It will hit equilibrium with the interstitial fluid. As the carbon dioxide moves from the interstitial fluid into the blood plasma, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma and the interstitial fluid will end up being exactly the same. Because again, think about it. As CO2 moves from the interstitial fluid into the blood plasma is just gaining carbon dioxide. So the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma will begin to rise, and it'll keep rising until the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma is the same as the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the interstitial fluid, which is 46. So you might say, how far does the blood actually have to travel past the interstitial fluid until the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the interstitial fluid in the blood plasma is the same? And not very far at all. It only needs to travel about a third of the distance down the capillary until they're at equilibrium. There's actually more to it than that, as you're about to see, but the point is this happens very, very quickly. Within milliseconds of the blood entering into the systemic capillary, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the interstitial fluid and the blood plasma that's within that systemic capillary will be the same. They'll be at equilibrium, which is 46. Now, I just alluded to the fact that there's a little bit more to it than that. And the reason that I'm saying that is because there has to be. Think about it. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide, let's say that the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma and the interstitial fluid is 46, right here. They're at equilibrium. Okay. In reality, how much carbon dioxide do you think has actually moved from the interstitial fluid into the blood plasma? The answer would be very, very little. Okay? Because CO2 is a very non-polar gas. It's a little bit more polar than oxygen, but not very much. So the point is, there's actually not very much CO2 in either one of these fluids right now. There's not very much CO2 in reality that exists within either the blood plasma or the interstitial fluid. So to say that, 6 millimeters of mercury in terms of a gradient of carbon dioxide went from the interstitial fluid into the blood plasma, that's not very much CO2 that has actually left the interstitial fluid and gone into the blood plasma. The cells of our body produce a lot of carbon dioxide. And this exchange of what's the equivalent of 6 millimeters of mercury of carbon dioxide between the interstitial fluid and the blood plasma to allow them both to become 46 millimeters of mercury, that's a very small amount of carbon dioxide that has actually gone into the blood plasma. So there has to be something else that is allowing for carbon dioxide to be transported within the blood, just like something else happens to allow for oxygen to be transported in the blood. Because if this is all that happened, the blood wouldn't take nearly enough CO2 away from the cells and the interstitial fluid, the cells in particular, which would be very, very dangerous for reasons that we'll discuss later on in the class. More carbon dioxide needs to be taken away by the blood than this. So how can that be accomplished? To resolve this issue, what we have to do is we have to look inside of the red blood cells. Okay, so inside of the red blood cells that exist within the blood, there is this enzyme that's referred to as carbonic anhydrase. And we have to think about, well, what is this enzyme going to do that has anything to do with, extracting carbon dioxide from the interstitial fluid around the muscle cells? So let's try and explain that, and this is going to involve some concepts from the last lecture. So here again is the systemic capillary. Inside of it initially is this oxygenated blood, which has a partial pressure of carbon dioxide within its plasma of 40. Inside of the interstitial fluid around the muscle cells, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 46 millimeters of mercury. So what's going to happen? You know the answer to all of this. Carbon dioxide is going to move from the interstitial fluid into the blood plasma until they're at equilibrium. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma will become 46 millimeters of mercury, but this is a totally insufficient amount of carbon dioxide that is actually being taken away by the blood plasma because the muscle cells produce enormous quantities of CO2. So the movement of only the equivalent of 6 millimeters of mercury of carbon dioxide into the blood plasma is not going to work. So what we have to do is we have to consider the red blood cells, which are also within the blood. Okay? That's the second component of the blood. It's the red blood cells, the plasma and the blood cells, the buffy coat too, but we're not talking about that. So within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell, we can assume that the partial pressure of carbon dioxide was initially 40 millimeters of mercury, right, to start off with. And then what do you have here, right? You have a gradient. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma is 46, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell is 40. So what's going to happen? Carbon dioxide is going to move from the blood plasma into the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell, which would transiently do what? Drive down the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma, but that would just allow for more carbon dioxide to move from the interstitial fluid into the blood plasma, which would drive it back up, and that would just keep this loop going from carbon dioxide moving from the interstitial fluid into the blood plasma, into the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell, until what? They would all be at 46. Okay, so yet again, we still have accomplished nothing here, because this is still carbon dioxide just being transported in the fluid, either the plasma or the intracellular fluid of the red blood cells. And not very much CO2 can exist within the fluid. So again, great that we can see this, but nothing has happened. The important part to realize is that carbon dioxide has moved from the blood plasma into the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell. And inside of the red blood cells, there's this enzyme, carbonic anhydrase. And what is it going to do? So what carbonic anhydrase, which is an enzyme, right? ACE means it's an enzyme. What carbonic anhydrase does, this is an enzyme that exists inside of erythrocytes, red blood cells. Carbonic anhydrase takes carbon dioxide and water and combines them and forms what's called carbonic acid. Carbonic anhydrase is an enzyme that exists inside of red blood cells and essentially creates carbonic acid out of carbon dioxide by combining the CO2 with water. Okay, now, carbonic acid is an acid, and it quickly dissociates into what's called bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion. Basically, since carbonic acid is an acid, it loses oftentimes a hydrogen ion in fluid, to the fluid, I should say. And when carbonic acid loses this hydrogen ion to the fluid, the loss of the hydrogen ion creates what is known as bicarbonate. Okay? If carbonic acid loses a hydrogen ion, it now is referred to as bicarbonate. So what happens to carbonic acid, what we say, is that it dissociates into a hydrogen ion and bicarbonate. Another way of saying that is carbonic acid becomes bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion. However way you want to say it, that's what's going to happen here. Once carbon dioxide enters into the red blood cell, inside of the red blood cell there will be this enzyme which is carbonic anhydrase. And carbonic anhydrase will take the carbon dioxide that came into the red blood cell, and carbonic anhydrase will combine the carbon dioxide with water to form carbonic acid. And then carbonic acid will very quickly it will dissociate into bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion. So this image is actually showing you the whole process playing out. Carbon dioxide is being created by the cells, right? Let's pretend that this is a muscle cell, right? Carbon dioxide is being created by the muscle cells as they're making ATP. And then the carbon dioxide moves out into the interstitial fluid. And then the carbon dioxide moves from the interstitial fluid down its partial pressure gradient into the blood plasma within this blood that's traveling through this systemic capillary. And now the carbon dioxide moves, the CO2 moves from the blood plasma into the red blood cells, right? It's moving into one red blood cell in this example. Now, as the carbon dioxide moves into the red blood cell, due to the partial pressure gradient that exists between the blood plasma and the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell, as the carbon dioxide moves into the red blood cell, carbonic anhydrase takes the CO2, combines it with water to form carbonic acid. And then what happens is carbonic acid dissociates or becomes bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion because it's an acid. Okay, and then there's this, kind of chloride shift that happens and whatnot. I don't care that you know this component of it. It's not all that important. The point that I want to make, though, is that now you have bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion that exists inside of the blood. You no longer have CO2, right? What you've done here, this is the important part, is you've turned CO2 into bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion. If you take CO2 and you turn it into bicarb and a hydrogen ion, then CO2 is no longer CO2. It's a completely different molecule. And you think, well, what benefit would this have? Well, for one thing, it contributes to acid-base chemistry, which is an important, this is acid-base chemistry, but it's important to the acid-base physiology of the human body for reasons that we won't get into really in this course. A little tiny bit, but not in any meaningful way. Okay. So it's important that you turn CO2 into bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion. One, for the kind of acid-base physiology of the human body that becomes important in different discussions. But two, there's something else that's very important about doing this. So let's talk about the other reason why we want to turn carbon dioxide into bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion within the red blood cells. So what's going to happen? This is stuff that you know. As oxygenated blood travels through a systemic capillary past the interstitial fluid, which is around the cells of our body, in this case muscle cells, the carbon dioxide is going to move from the interstitial fluid into the blood, right, into the blood plasma. The reason for that is because the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma initially is 40, right, within the oxygenated blood. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the interstitial fluid is 46, so there's a partial pressure gradient. Carbon dioxide moves from the interstitial fluid into the blood plasma, right, follows its partial pressure gradient, and drives the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma up to 46, which is the same as the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the interstitial fluid. At the same time, we just spoke about a little bit ago how this would result in the intracellular fluid of the red blood cells having then a partial pressure of carbon dioxide of 46 as well. Okay, so everything would be at equilibrium. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the interstitial fluid would be 46, within the blood plasma would be 46, and within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell it would be 46. Now, this carbon dioxide that is within the red blood cell, what's going to happen to it once it goes into the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell? Well, there's carbonic anhydrase within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell, this enzyme that turns CO2 with water into carbonic acid, which then dissociates into bicarb and a hydrogen ion. The point here is, if you take CO2 within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell and you turn it in to something else, bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion, then it's not CO2 anymore, right? It's something else. You've turned CO2 within the red blood cell literally into a different molecule. So if it's not CO2 anymore, what do you think that means for the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell? It's of course going to fall, because what you're doing is you're removing CO2 in its present form from the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell by turning it into bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion. So rather than attributing numbers to this, we can just acknowledge the fact that the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell is going to fall as the carbon dioxide is turned into bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion. So what value does this serve? Well, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma would still be 46. And the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell is falling. So what I'm saying is the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma will be greater than the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell. So what's going to happen? Carbon dioxide is going to begin to move down its partial pressure gradient. It's going to move from the blood plasma into the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell. And what's that going to do? It's going to cause the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma to fall. Why? Because carbon dioxide is moving from the blood plasma into the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell. So thus, the blood plasma, is losing carbon dioxide to the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell. So the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma must be falling. And now what do you have? The partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the interstitial fluid is still 46, which is greater now than the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma. So what you've just accomplished here by turning carbon dioxide within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell into bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion, what you've accomplished is you've reestablished the partial pressure gradient between the interstitial fluid, the partial pressure gradient for carbon dioxide, you've reestablished it between the interstitial fluid and the blood plasma. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the interstitial fluid is 46 still, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma is less because it's entering now into the carbon dioxide within the blood plasma is entering into the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell, which is driving it down. So what's going to happen? Carbon dioxide is going to begin to move again from the interstitial fluid into the blood plasma, right? And what's that going to do? It's going to drive the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma up. It's going to drive it back up to 46. And what's happening inside of the red blood cell? Well, inside of the red blood cell, the carbon dioxide that is within there is being turned into bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion, which keeps lowering the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell. So what's going to happen? Carbon dioxide is going to keep moving from the blood plasma, where the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is higher, into the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell, where the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is lower because the carbon dioxide keeps getting turned into something else. So you have a continuous loop here, right, where carbon dioxide moves let's say this correctly. You have a continuous loop here. As long as the CO2 within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell. Like everything starts at 46 right here. As long as 46 millimeters of mercury, partial pressure of carbon dioxide. As long as the CO2 within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell keeps getting turned into bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion, then the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell is going to keep falling. And it's going to keep becoming less than the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma. So carbon dioxide is then just going to keep continuously moving from the blood plasma into the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell, which is going to keep doing what? It's going to keep driving down the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma so that it is less than the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the interstitial fluid, which means that carbon dioxide is just going to keep coming from the interstitial fluid into the blood plasma. And that's going to keep driving the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma up so that it's greater than the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell, so that it will keep moving from the plasma into the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell, where the carbon dioxide will keep getting turned into bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion, which will keep lowering the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell. And that will keep this loop going for a little bit of time. Right? It's going to keep this loop going for long enough that a lot of carbon dioxide is actually going to come from the interstitial fluid into the blood. Carbon dioxide is just going to keep flowing from the interstitial fluid into the blood plasma, into the red blood cell, and being turned into bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion. This process is what allows our blood to actually extract a lot of carbon dioxide from the interstitial fluid. It's the fact that our blood actually carries most of our carbon dioxide as bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion. What that does is, by carrying CO2 as mostly bicarb and a hydrogen ion within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell, what that does is it continuously reestablishes the partial pressure gradient between the interstitial fluid and the blood plasma, right? Because that's going to keep forcing carbon dioxide to move from the blood plasma into the interstitial fluid. That's going to keep forcing carbon dioxide to move from the blood plasma into the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell, which is going to keep driving down the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma, so that it's less than the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the interstitial fluid, which is just going to keep pulling more and more and more and more carbon dioxide from the interstitial fluid into the blood plasma. Right? So the value of carrying carbon dioxide as bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion is it continuously reestablishes the partial pressure gradient for carbon dioxide between the interstitial fluid and the blood plasma, so that carbon dioxide can just keep entering into the blood plasma and then into the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell. So this is really how our body is able to extract a lot of carbon dioxide actually from the interstitial fluid around the cells of our body. Because again, if everything just were to right away equilibrate at 46, right? The partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the interstitial fluid is 46, within the plasma is 46, and within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cells is 46. That's actually not very much carbon dioxide that has gone from the interstitial fluid into the blood, right? That's only the equivalent of 6 millimeters of mercury of carbon dioxide. It's very, very little. Not nearly enough carbon dioxide would be taken away from the interstitial fluid from the cells of our body. But by carrying CO2 as bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell, that keeps, by turning CO2 into something else, by carrying it as something else within the bloodstream,
that keeps driving down the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma compared to the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the interstitial fluid, right? It continuously reestablishes the gradient between the interstitial fluid and the blood plasma so that more and more and more and more carbon dioxide can just keep coming into the bloodstream because it's actually being carried mostly as something else in the bloodstream.
So eventually, this chemical equation will come to a halt. Okay, this is going to ultimately be true for every chemical equation, and this would require a whole lesson in chemistry and equilibriums and all these things that it's just not part of this class. The point is, due to the law of mass action, if you increase the amount of CO2, it's going to push this equation to the right. Okay, as more CO2 comes into the blood plasma and then into the red blood cells, you're increasing the amount of CO2 within the red blood cells, and it pushes this equation to the right, right? That CO2 will get converted ultimately into carbonic acid and then bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion. But eventually, you will have created enough bicarbonate and hydrogen ions that you can't push this equation anymore to the right with the amount of CO2 that exists in the blood. The point is, you'll have created essentially, based upon the specifics of this chemical equation, you will have created enough bicarbonate and hydrogen ions that with the amount of CO2 that's in the red blood cell, you can't push the equation any further to the right, right? And at that point, what happens?
I can tell you exactly what would happen. If this is the systemic capillary, right, inside of this red blood cell, this erythrocyte, it's maxed out in terms of the amount of bicarbonate and hydrogen ions that it can create. Right? This equation has been pushed as far to the right as possible based upon the amount of CO2 that exists within the blood. And by consequence, no more of the CO2 can be turned into bicarb and a hydrogen ion. So for the moment, let's pretend that the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell is lower than the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma. Okay, let's pretend that the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma is 46, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the interstitial fluid, as we know, is 46. What will happen? Well, carbon dioxide will move down its partial pressure gradient, right? It will move from the blood plasma into the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell, and it will drive the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell up to 46, and no more of that carbon dioxide will be able to be turned into bicarb and hydrogen ion. Okay? In the meantime, that will cause the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma to fall. That will allow carbon dioxide to move from the interstitial fluid into the blood plasma until the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma is 46. And now where do you go from here? Right? The answer is nowhere. Right? You're at complete equilibrium at this point. Right? The partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the interstitial fluid is 46, within the blood plasma is 46, and within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell is 46. Clearly, no more carbon dioxide can travel from the blood plasma into the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell anymore because the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell is 46, so there's not a gradient between the plasma and the intracellular fluid anymore. So this is what deoxygenated blood looks like, right? The partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma is 46, within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cells is 46, and very importantly, the vast majority of carbon dioxide that has been extracted from the interstitial fluid is actually being carried in the blood as bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion, or bicarbonates and hydrogen ions, they're plural. In this particular circumstance, the only way, there are other ways to do this, but in this circumstance, the only way to get the blood to take any more carbon dioxide would be to somehow turn more carbon dioxide within the intracellular fluid to turn more carbon dioxide within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell into more bicarbonate and hydrogen ions, right? Because then that would lower the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell, so more carbon dioxide could move from the plasma into the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell, and it would become less in the plasma, and more could move from the interstitial fluid, right, into blood plasma. But that can't happen, right? Because at this point, when you get to the point where no bicarbonate, where no more carbon dioxide can be turned into bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion, when you reach that point, then you're just stuck. Everything simply equilibrates at a partial pressure of 46 millimeters of mercury. And this is what deoxygenated blood is going to look like. This is the carbon dioxide component of it. You saw in the other lectures the oxygen component of what deoxygenated blood looks like. I'll finish this deoxygenation process with saying I hope that you now can understand the value in our blood carrying the vast majority of CO2 as bicarbonate and hydrogen ions, right? It does a couple things, right? Bicarb and hydrogen ions. Right? What that does is, one, it's important for the acid-base chemistry of the human body, but two, this is what ensures that our blood can actually carry a lot of carbon dioxide. By turning CO2 into bicarb and a hydrogen ion, it continuously reestablishes the gradient between the interstitial fluid and the blood plasma so that more and more CO2 can come in and that our blood can actually carry sufficient quantities of carbon dioxide. So we just looked at the creation of deoxygenated blood at the level of the systemic capillaries. As oxygenated blood travels through a systemic capillary, it becomes deoxygenated, right? Carbon dioxide travels from the interstitial fluid into it. It's also true that oxygen travels from the blood into the interstitial fluid, but that's what we looked at in the prior lecture. Right now we're focusing on carbon dioxide. You can imagine both of those are happening simultaneously, but we're focusing on CO2. So we've created deoxygenated blood. Right. As the blood went through the systemic capillary, it became systemic capillary, it became deoxygenated. A bunch of carbon dioxide went into it. And now this deoxygenated blood, what is it going to do? It's going to travel through a systemic vein back to the right side of the heart. The right side of the heart is going to pump the blood into the pulmonary circuit. You've seen all of this. And now the pulmonary circuit is going to take the blood to the lungs. The pulmonary arteries are going to become the pulmonary arterioles. And the pulmonary arterioles are going to turn into the pulmonary capillaries, which surround the alveoli. Okay? And now we're taking this deoxygenated blood past the alveoli. And what we want to do is we want to look at the exchange of carbon dioxide rather than oxygen, because we've already looked at oxygen. We want to look at how carbon dioxide goes from the blood and into the alveoli so that we can exhale the carbon dioxide out. Okay. Again, what we're doing here at the lungs is we're oxygenating blood. And part of the oxygenation process involves carbon dioxide leaving the blood. We've looked at how oxygen goes into the blood during the oxygenation process, but we haven't looked at how CO2 leaves the blood and into the lungs, right? So that's what we've got to do now. So here is an alveolus, and here is a pulmonary capillary. What's traveling through the pulmonary capillary? Well, first, deoxygenated blood. What do we know about deoxygenated blood? Within the blood plasma of deoxygenated blood, there's a partial pressure of carbon dioxide of about 46. All right. We know that most of the carbon dioxide is actually being carried as bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion, but we also know that the partial pressure of carbon dioxide of the blood plasma is about 46 millimeters of mercury. Now, what about in the air that exists in the alveoli? Well, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the air is about 40. Now, again,
you might say, well, why is the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the air so high? Like, because if you think of the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the atmosphere, it's like nothing. And this partly leads into a separate conversation about dead space. Like air that there's constantly a certain amount of air that you don't blow out of your lungs, right? Residual volume. And that air is from the deepest parts of your lungs that's richer in carbon dioxide. And that air keeps getting re-inhaled afterwards. And through that process of not being able to blow off air that's rich in carbon dioxide and then continually inhaling it, it drives up the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the air in the alveoli, much more so than the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the air in the atmosphere. Okay, so that's why this alveolar air has a partial pressure of carbon dioxide that's much higher than atmospheric air. Okay, you could have a 20-minute conversation about the whole process by which that plays out, but you'll just have to believe me. So, yet again, we have this alveolus, and there's air within it, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within that air is about 40 millimeters of mercury. Now, as this blood, this deoxygenated blood, is traveling past this alveolus, there's clearly a partial pressure gradient. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma is greater than the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the air in the alveoli. So what happens? Well, clearly, carbon dioxide wants to move down its partial pressure gradient, and it wants to move from the blood plasma into the air within the alveoli. Right? It wants to move from a higher partial pressure of 46 to a lower partial pressure of 40. It wants to move from the blood plasma into the air within the alveoli, right? From a high to a low partial pressure. And that's exactly what it does. Okay. But now here's the interesting thing. We're back to discussing the exchange of a gas between a fluid and air. Okay. So here's a huge difference. As the carbon dioxide moves from the blood plasma into the air in the alveoli, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma falls, right? It's going to begin to fall towards 40. But then you say, well, does the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the air rise? And the answer to that is no. Okay? There's actually not that much carbon dioxide that exists in the blood plasma. Carbon dioxide is mostly nonpolar. The blood plasma is mostly made up of water, and it's polar. They don't exist together very well. So there's not actually that much carbon dioxide that is traveling from the blood plasma into the air in the alveoli. It's a 6 millimeter of mercury change, right? There's the equivalent of 6 millimeters of mercury of pressure of carbon dioxide that's being lost from the blood plasma into the air in the alveoli. And that's not actually that much carbon dioxide, right? And there's proportionally in terms of concentration, the actual amount of carbon dioxide molecules, there's infinitely more carbon dioxide that actually exists in the air in the alveoli compared to the blood plasma. So the point is, so few molecules of carbon dioxide are actually going into the air within the alveoli that the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the air in the alveoli actually doesn't change hardly at all. It pretty much just stays at 40, right? There's some carbon dioxide, CO2, leaving the blood plasma, going into the air in the alveoli. But again, carbon dioxide doesn't exist in the blood plasma very well, so that to drive down the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma from 46 to 40, it doesn't actually require that many molecules of CO2 leaving. And there's an enormous quantity in terms of number of CO2 molecules that exist within the air in the alveoli, comparatively. So these carbon dioxide molecules that are moving from the blood plasma into the air in the alveoli, they don't really change the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the air in the alveoli at all. They do drive it up, to some incredibly small, degree. But there's not actually enough CO2 molecules moving into the air in the alveoli to drive the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the air in the alveoli up to any meaningful degree. So the point is, yet again, they're going to hit equilibrium when they're both at 40, right? And the real point here is, even as the carbon dioxide leaves the blood plasma and goes into the alveoli, that causes the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma to drop, but it doesn't cause the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the air in the alveoli to increase, right? It just pretty much stays the same. So they both end up being 40. This is very different than when you talk about the exchange, for example, of carbon dioxide or oxygen between two fluids. That's the point I'm trying to make here. Now, another real question is, if carbon dioxide is moving from the blood plasma into the air in the alveoli due to this partial pressure gradient, right, 46 to 40, then the amount of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma is falling. And what's going to happen to the carbon dioxide that exists within the red blood cell, right? The intracellular fluid of the red blood cell, it's going to leave, because just think about it. To start off with, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma is 46. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell is 46. They're the same. And as carbon dioxide moves from the blood plasma into the air in the alveoli, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma will presumably fall, right? And then carbon dioxide is going to move from the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell out into the blood plasma. Carbon dioxide is going to move down it's going to move down a partial pressure gradient here, right? Carbon dioxide is going to move from the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell, where the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 46, out into the blood plasma, where the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma is 40, right? And that will cause the partial pressure of carbon dioxide ultimately within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell to fall, right? Drive up the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood plasma, which will then just shoot right back out into the air in the alveoli as well anyways. Okay, so the point I'm trying to make here is the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell will fall when the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma falls. It's only logical, right? That's what's going to happen. And if you drive down the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the red blood cell, within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell, does that have any effect on that bicarbonate equation? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. What are you removing from the red blood cell? What's leaving? Carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is going from the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell out into the blood plasma, where then it is leaving off into the air in the alveoli. So the amount of carbon dioxide within the red blood cell right now is falling. And due to the law of mass action, what will that do? It'll push this equation to the left, right? This equation is reversible. And if you remove carbon dioxide from the red blood cell, which is happening right now, because the carbon dioxide is leaving out into the blood plasma and then going into the air in the alveoli. If you extract carbon dioxide from the red blood cell, due to the law of mass action in chemistry, it'll push this equation in the opposite direction. It'll go to the left. What I mean by that is bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion will recombine into carbonic acid, and then carbonic anhydrase will start converting carbonic acid back into CO2 and water. This is an incredibly important point. So here we'll draw it out. Okay. Here's a red blood cell. Okay. To start off with, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma is 46. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell is 46. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the air in the alveoli is 40. So carbon dioxide will move from the blood plasma into the air in the alveoli down its partial pressure gradient. That will cause the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma to fall. And now carbon dioxide will move from the red blood cell out into the blood plasma, where there's a gradient again, right? So the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell will fall. And the point is, now there is less CO2 in the red blood cell, right? That has to be true. There's less CO2 within the red blood cell because the CO2 is moving out into the blood plasma, so then it can move out into the air in the alveoli. So the amount of CO2 within the red blood cell is falling, and that is now pushing that bicarbonate equation to the left, right? So what's happening is bicarb and a hydrogen ion are recombining to form carbonic acid, which is then, through carbonic anhydrase, being turned back in to CO2 and water. Okay, well, what does that mean for the amount of carbon dioxide now that exists in the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell? Well, obviously, if you begin to turn bicarbonate and hydrogen ions back into CO2, then the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell will rise. Right? It'll rise back up. I don't know exactly what that number is going to be, but it's going to rise back up. And now, where is this carbon dioxide going to go? It's going to move from the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell out into the blood plasma, and then, again, right out into the air in the alveoli. And as the carbon dioxide continuously moves out into the blood plasma and then follows its gradient into the air in the alveoli, it's just going to continuously drop the amount of carbon dioxide that exists in the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell, which is going to keep pushing this equation to the left. All of this bicarb and hydrogen ions that you created at the level of the tissues is going to be turned back in to CO2 and water. And this CO2 is going to keep accumulating in the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell. It's going to keep then traveling out into the blood plasma, following its gradient, going into the air in the alveoli. And this is just going to keep happening and keep happening until, based upon many aspects of the equation that relate to chemistry that we're not discussing, the equation can't be pushed any further to the left, which is mostly going to be dictated by the amount of bicarbonate that there is. You will reach a point where the equation can't be pushed any further to the left. Based upon many factors, you reach a point through this equation, this chemical equation reaction, where you just can't push it any further to the left. You're going to turn as much bicarbonate and hydrogen ions back to CO2 and water as possible. And then it can't be pushed any further to the left. And at the point where you can't push the equation any further to the left, what happens?
So acknowledging that that equation reaches a point where it can't be pushed any further to the left, that allows us to try to put all of this together. So here is an alveolus. Here is pulmonary capillary. What do we know is happening? Partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the air in this alveolus is 40. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma is 46 millimeters of mercury. The same is true for the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell. It's 46 millimeters of mercury, and the vast majority of the CO2 is being carried as bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion. Okay, so what's going to happen is carbon dioxide is going to move from the blood plasma into the air in the alveoli, right? Carbon dioxide is going to follow its partial pressure gradient from the blood plasma into the air in the alveoli, or in the alveolus in this example. And what is that going to do? Rather than attributing numbers to this, it's going to drop down the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma, clearly. Okay, because carbon dioxide is leaving the blood plasma into the air in this alveolus, so the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma is less. And now the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell is greater. So carbon dioxide is going to move from the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell, where the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is still 46, into the blood plasma, where the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is less. That's going to drive the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma back up, so that there's a gradient between the partial pressure carbon dioxide partial pressure gradient between the blood plasma and the air in this alveolus, so that carbon dioxide will then follow its partial pressure gradient again from the blood plasma into the air, into the alveolus here. Okay, but importantly, what that does is it drives down the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell, right? Because the carbon dioxide is leaving the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell to go out into the plasma, right? Following its partial pressure gradient, and then driving the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the plasma up so that it can go into the air in the alveolus here. Okay, but driving the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell down pushes the bicarbonate equation to the left, right? And that turns bicarb and hydrogen ions back into CO2, right, and water, thanks to carbonic anhydrase. And what does that do? It very importantly, it drives up the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell. So now it is less than the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma. So now carbon dioxide is going to keep leaving the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell into the blood plasma following its partial pressure gradient. And that's going to do what? Drive the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma up so that it's greater than the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the air in this alveolus, so that it will follow its gradient and go into the air in this alveolus. And through that process, through this loop here that just keeps happening, it's continuously driving the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell down, right? Because the carbon dioxide just keeps going into the blood plasma where the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is less, driving the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the plasma up, which causes the carbon dioxide to leave into the air in the alveoli, which keeps driving the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the plasma down, which keeps then pushing more carbon dioxide from the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell out into the plasma. And this is just going to keep happening until all of that bicarbonate and hydrogen ions that we made at the level of the tissues gets turned back into CO2. Because as long as that bicarb and hydrogen and those hydrogen ions can keep being turned back into CO2, it's going to keep driving up the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell, and it'll keep following its gradient, the CO2, into the plasma and into the air in this alveolus. That's going to keep happening until you reach the point where you can't turn any more of the bicarb and the hydrogen ions back into CO2. So you would end up in this circumstance, let's just start here like we did last time. Let's say the CO2 is elevated, right, inside of the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell. Right? The partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell is 46, let's just say. Okay. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma is 40. So what's going to happen? Carbon dioxide is going to move from the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell out into the plasma. It's going to follow its partial pressure gradient. That's going to drive the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the plasma up above the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the air in the alveolus. It's going to go into the air in the alveolus, which is just going to drive the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma right back down as it leaves into the air in the alveolus. It's going to drive it back down to 40. And now we would say that the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell is 40. Right? So there's no more gradient between the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell and the plasma anymore. It's gone. So there's not going to be any more movement between carbon dioxide in the blood plasma and intracellular fluid. And that is because all of that bicarbonate, all of those bicarbonates and hydrogen ions have been turned back into CO2, and there's no ability to turn any more back into CO2. Okay, so you're stuck at that point. The only way that you could keep this loop going is if somehow you were able to turn more bicarb and hydrogen ions back into CO2 and drive the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the intracellular fluid back up so that it can move into the plasma and out to the air again. But you can't do that. It's come to an end. And that's where everything is going to equilibrate at 40 millimeters of mercury. Right? So if we look over here, we are now going to have what is known as oxygenated blood. Right? What are we going to have? We're going to have the blood plasma is going to have a partial pressure of carbon dioxide of 40. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the red blood cells is going to be 40 millimeters of mercury as well. And there's not going to be a whole lot of CO2 in the blood that's being carried as bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion right now. That is what oxygenated blood looks like on the carbon dioxide side. We looked at the oxygen side of things, right? And now we're looking at the carbon dioxide side of things. And you've seen this before because this is the blood, this oxygenated blood is the blood that goes past our tissues. This is the blood that's going to travel through the systemic capillaries. Right? Hopefully we just spoke about that, so hopefully you remember. Right? Think about it. This is the blood. This is oxygenated blood. It has a partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma of 40, within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell of 40, and there's very little CO2 being carried as bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion. And then it's going to go past the interstitial fluid, which is around, in my example, our muscle cells, where the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 46 within the interstitial fluid. And that's going to drive this whole loop process to occur again until you create deoxygenated blood. And we know that deoxygenated blood, right, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the plasma is 46, within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cells is 46, and the vast majority of CO2 is actually being carried in the blood as bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion. And now this deoxygenated blood is going to go right back to the lungs, which is what we were looking at, and the same exact thing is going to happen. Right? This deoxygenated blood is now going to travel past the lungs, where the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the blood plasma is 46, within the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell is 46, and a whole bunch of CO2 is being carried in the blood as bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion. And the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the air in the alveolus is 40, so CO2 follows its partial pressure gradient, right? And the loop process begins again, where CO2 moves from the intracellular fluid of the red blood cell out into the plasma, out into the air in the alveolus, and then that drives the bicarbonate equation to the left, right? And that just keeps this whole process going until you've created again oxygenated blood. I do not have the time to recap everything in the kind of detail that I've gone through in order to put it all together, but I think I can show you the basics here, and hopefully you can take that information, the more detailed information, and put it into this. What I want you to recognize is that when blood is oxygenated and deoxygenated, the exchange of both carbon dioxide and oxygen happens simultaneously. So if this is an alveolus here, and here is a pulmonary capillary, right? What's traveling through this is deoxygenated blood. Okay? It's coming from the right side of the heart. The right side of the heart contracted, and it pushed deoxygenated blood into the pulmonary arteries, which became the pulmonary arterioles, and then that became the pulmonary capillaries. Okay? So the deoxygenated blood is traveling through this pulmonary capillary, and then what happens? Two things. CO2 is going to leave the deoxygenated blood, and oxygen is going to come in to the deoxygenated blood. And there's an exchange of gases. CO2 is going to move from the blood into the air in the alveoli, and oxygen is going to move from the air in the alveoli into the blood, and that's going to form what we know as oxygenated blood. Right? We've taken deoxygenated blood and created oxygenated blood at the level of the lungs. at the level of the alveoli, right? This blood is going to have lots of oxygen and less carbon dioxide within it. And then what's going to happen is this blood is going to travel through the pulmonary venules into the pulmonary veins, and it's going to be returned to the left side of the heart. And then the left side of the heart is going to contract, and it's going to push that blood out into the systemic circuit. It's going to travel out into the systemic arteries, which become the systemic arterioles, which eventually then become the systemic capillaries. And the systemic capillaries take oxygenated blood, which we created at the lungs, past the tissues of our body. And what happens then? The oxygenated blood is going to become deoxygenated. This oxygenated blood is rich in oxygen and poor in carbon dioxide, and that's going to allow for carbon dioxide to move from the interstitial fluid into the blood, right? The carbon dioxide is going to move from around the tissues of our body into our blood. The CO2 is created by the tissues of our body, and the oxygen is going to move from our blood into the interstitial fluid and go into our cells so that they can use it to make ATP. And through this process of deoxygenation, right, the blood loses oxygen, gives off oxygen, maybe a more appropriate way to say it, to the tissues of our body, and it takes away or gains the carbon dioxide from the tissues that created the carbon dioxide. And now you have deoxygenated blood, which is poor in oxygen and rich in carbon dioxide. Okay. And now this deoxygenated blood is going to travel through the systemic venules into the systemic veins and be brought right back to the right side of the heart. And the right side of the heart is going to contract, and it's going to push this deoxygenated blood into the pulmonary circuit. And this deoxygenated blood is going to travel through the pulmonary arteries, pulmonary arterioles, into the pulmonary capillaries, and it's going to become oxygenated. And the oxygenated blood is going to return through the pulmonary venules and pulmonary veins back to the left side of the heart, which is going to pump the blood into the systemic circuit, which is going to the systemic circuit, then through the arteries and arterioles of the systemic circuit is going to bring that blood right back into the systemic capillaries so that oxygen can be given off to our tissues and carbon dioxide can be taken away, and we'll make deoxygenated blood, and then it will return again, right, to the lungs. So what I'm trying to say is the exchange of these gases happens simultaneously at both the level of the lungs and the level of the tissues. Right? And this loop just keeps going all day long throughout your entire life. Or at least we hope it does, because if it didn't, something catastrophic would happen. So this is the whole picture. I mean, there's more to the picture. This is the majority of the picture of gas exchange.
That's exactly what this is showing. And my hope is, at the end of this, which is really, we're approaching the end now, is you can look at something like this and you can know what it's showing you, right? Like this is blood becoming oxygenated at the lungs. And this is blood becoming deoxygenated at the tissues of the body, right? This is blood traveling through the pulmonary capillaries and becoming oxygenated. This is blood traveling through the systemic capillaries and becoming deoxygenated. Hopefully, to some degree, you can look at something like this now, and it makes a decent amount of sense. I'm going to finish this lecture by discussing how the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve can change based upon different circumstances that you are in and why that would be beneficial. We're going to start off, I'm really just going to focus on one of these, which is two of them actually, which is temperature and acidity. So let's imagine that you're engaged in some type of physical activity. Okay, maybe you're having to jog to class, maybe you're exercising, I don't know, and exercise and physical activity can be defined differently, but you're engaging in some activity, physical activity. Okay, What does that involve? It involves you contracting your muscle fibers more. Okay, let's pretend that these are muscle fibers. These are muscle cells. Okay, there are muscle cells located in one of your quadricep muscles. Okay, and you're running. Okay, again, maybe you're running on a treadmill because you're exercising. Maybe you're having to jog to class. Who knows? Okay, maybe you're lifting a plant outside. I don't know. The muscle fibers within this muscle are contracting more forcefully and frequently than they normally do. So what are they doing? They're consuming more ATP, and thus they're having to make more ATP, and thus what are they producing more of? They're producing more CO2. Okay, they're producing more CO2. And also something else is happening if you're engaging in physical activity. You're going to be getting hot. Okay, why do you get hot? Because two reasons. When you engage in physical activity, you get hot because you break down more macronutrients to make ATP. Like when you break down glucose to make ATP, heat is released. Okay, if you light like starch, right? That's made up of glucose monomers. If you light starch on fire, right, you lose energy in the form of heat, right? You turn glucose essentially into heat by, lighting it on fire. That's basically what your body does. Okay? It breaks glucose down as if, again, you were to light it on fire. But what it does is the heat, the energy isn't all released as heat. What our body tries to do is it tries to harness the energy and make ATP out of it. But it's not perfect. Our body is not perfect at doing this. And still, when you break the glucose down, a lot of the energy is lost as heat. When you light glucose on fire, really all the energy is lost as heat. If you were to light starch on fire, all the energy would more or less be lost as heat. In our bodies, when we break glucose down, imagine kind of lighting it on fire, we harness a lot of that energy to make ATP, but a good portion of it is still lost in the form of heat. Okay, so when you're engaged in physical activity, you break more macronutrients down to make more ATP, and more heat is produced. And the second thing that produces heat is just the breakdown of ATP. When you break down ATP into ADP, different components of a cell will consume the energy. But also, when you break the ATP down into ADP, some of the energy is just lost in the form of heat. The cell harnesses some of that energy to do physical work, but some of that energy that's produced from breaking ATP down into ADP is just lost in the form of heat. Okay, so there's two things that are really important for producing heat when you're engaged in physical activity. The cells of your body, particularly your muscle cells, when you're engaged in physical activity, are breaking more macronutrients down. Okay? And when you break more macronutrients down to make ATP, the breakdown of those macronutrients, a lot of energy is lost in the form of heat, which makes the body hot. At the same time, the cells of your body are consuming more ATP. And when you consume ATP, when you break down ATP, a lot of the energy through the breakdown of ATP is lost in the form of heat. So I'm trying to make a point. When you engage in physical activity, I think we all know this, we get hot. But there's a reason why our body gets hot, right? It's through the breakdown of macronutrients where heat is produced, and it's through the breakdown of ATP where heat is produced. The cells of our body, our muscle cells, are the reason for this heat being produced in our body. And additionally, if our muscle cells are breaking more macronutrients down, like glucose and fatty acids, to make ATP, they're also producing more carbon dioxide. So number one, your body gets hot when you engage in physical activity. You get warm. Okay? You can get very hot, right? To the point you can end up with heat stroke. Okay, so you get very hot, like especially if you're in a hot environment. That leads into a whole other conversation about, kind of the physiology of exercise related to different environments, which we don't do in this class. So anyways, you get very hot when you're engaged in physical activity. And additionally, through that process of breaking more macronutrients down, meaning the muscle cells breaking more macronutrients down, they produce more CO2. And that increase in CO2, we won't go through all of the mechanisms by, kind of increasing the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within the interstitial fluid, which then creates a greater gradient between the interstitial fluid and the blood. So more carbon dioxide goes into the blood. We will just, rather than going through all that, we'll just say if the muscle cells produce more CO2 during physical activity, then there's more CO2 that ends up in your bloodstream, period. When you're engaged in physical activity, the amount of CO2 that's actually in your blood increases pretty dramatically depending upon the intensity of the activity. So two things here. When you engage in physical activity, one, your body gets hot. Number two, the amount of CO2 in your bloodstream increases. Number one is easy. We don't need to discuss that any further, right? Our body just simply gets hotter as we engage in physical activity due to the breakdown of macronutrients and the breakdown of ATP, where energy is released in the form of heat, which makes us hot. Number two here, on the other hand, requires a little bit more of a discussion. If you have more CO2 in your blood, then what also do you have more of? What's CO2 mostly carried as? CO2 is mostly carried as bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion. Well, what does pH mean? pH means potential hydrogens. So if you put more hydrogens in a solution, which is exactly what's happening right now, you will decrease the pH. You will make the body more acidic. This begins the conversation. Remember I said turning CO2 into bicarbonate and hydrogen ion has some acid-base physiology that is involved as well, and this is a portion of it. CO2 is carried as bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion. If you put hydrogen ions into solutions, they become acidic. Okay? The more hydrogen ions within a solution, the more acidic the solution is. So I think it should be pretty clear. The more CO2 that you have in your bloodstream, the more bicarbonate and hydrogen ions you have in the bloodstream, and the more acidic your bloodstream is. So the correct way of saying this actually is that when you engage in physical activity, one, you get hot, and two, your body begins to become acidic. There are other reasons why the body becomes acidic as well, because hydrogen ions don't just come from CO2, but again, conversation for another day, another class actually. One of the main reasons that our body becomes acidic when we engage in physical activity, it's quite simple. When we engage in physical activity, the cells that are contracting more are consuming more ATP, so they need to make more ATP. To make more ATP, they do that through oxidative phosphorylation, the process of breaking macronutrients down with oxygen to make ATP in the electron transport chain, and that process produces more carbon dioxide. So during physical activity, our cells make more ATP and through that process produce more CO2, and that CO2 ends up in our bloodstream being carried as bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion. Hydrogen ions make fluids and acidic, so thus when we engage in physical activity, our body becomes more acidic due to more CO2 being in our bloodstream. This is why people tell you that CO2 is acidic, if you've ever heard that. Right? It's because of the way that it's carried. It's carried as bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion, so it makes, mostly that's the way that it's carried, so it makes fluids, which is what our blood is made up of mostly, is fluid. It makes fluids acidic, makes your body acidic. So what happens when the body becomes hot and acidic for the reasons that we just discussed? The oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve gets pushed to the right, at least the more central portion of the curve does. The upper portion and lower portions of the curve actually don't change that much, but in the middle, the curve changes pretty significantly. That's important, okay? Because if you push the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve to the right, what exactly does that mean? Okay, well, we can draw this. Like, so here is, oh no, I didn't mean to draw an alveoli. Here is tissues. Okay. Here is blood traveling past the tissues. What do we know happens to oxygenated blood as it travels past our tissues? Well, it goes from having a partial pressure of oxygen of 100 to end up to ending up having a partial pressure of oxygen of 40, right? This is what happens to oxygenated blood as it goes through a systemic capillary. Like these are the contracting muscle cells, for example, okay? This is oxygenated blood traveling through a systemic capillary, right? The partial pressure of oxygen within oxygenated blood, the partial pressure of oxygen within the blood plasma of oxygenated blood, is 100. And when you get to the distal end, the partial pressure of oxygen within the blood plasma of the blood reaches about 40. Okay, it equilibrates with the interstitial fluid. Now here's the thing. When you drive the partial pressure of oxygen within the blood plasma down to 40 millimeters of mercury, what normally happens? We can go up here and we can look at the blue line, which is here. I'm drawing it in red. If we drive the partial pressure of oxygen within the blood plasma down to 40 millimeters of mercury, then hemoglobin will unload about 25% of its oxygen, right? It'll go from being 100% saturated to approximately 75% saturated. That's what usually happens to hemoglobin when you drive the partial pressure of oxygen within the blood plasma down to 40 millimeters of mercury, right? When the partial pressure of oxygen within the blood plasma is 100, then hemoglobin is approximately 100% saturated. That's oxygenated blood. And then as the oxygenated blood goes past the tissues, right, the oxygenated blood travels through a systemic capillary, the partial pressure of oxygen within the blood plasma drops to 40. And we know this, we talked about it extensively. Hemoglobin then will unload about 25% of its oxygen. It'll go to being 75% saturated. And that's how the majority of O2 actually then, of course, gets into our tissues, because oxygen within the blood is mostly carried bound to hemoglobin. Okay, we're engaged in physical activity right now, and our body is hot and it is acidic. Because our body is hot and acidic during physical activity, that pushes the hemoglobin dissociation curve to the right. Look at this. In red, this is what the hemoglobin dissociation curve normally looks like. And on the right, this is the hemoglobin dissociation curve when the body is hot and acidic. It actually could be either one, but when we engage in physical activity, it's usually a combination of both. What in the world does this mean? Okay. Take a look. As oxygenated blood goes past these tissues, right? As oxygenated blood travels through a systemic capillary, the partial pressure of oxygen goes from 100 down to 40. Normally, that would then cause hemoglobin to unload. 25% of its oxygen becomes 75% saturated. Okay, but the body is hot and acidic, and the curve has been pushed to the right. Okay, so let's just follow this up and figure out what's going to happen. If this is a hot and acidic environment and the hemoglobin dissociation curve is shifted to the right, then what's going to happen when the partial pressure of oxygen within the blood plasma is 40 millimeters of mercury? Well, look at this. Just follow it over. Hemoglobin will actually unload something like 50% of its oxygen, right? When the partial pressure of oxygen is 40 millimeters of mercury in the blood plasma. Right? When the body is hot and acidic, the hemoglobin dissociation curve shifts to the right. And what that means is that the same partial pressure of 40 millimeters of mercury in the blood plasma, hemoglobin will unload 50% of its oxygen and become approximately 50% saturated, rather than what it normally does, which is unload 25% of its oxygen and become 75% saturated. So we need to do two things here. We need to, one, make sure this makes sense, and two, explain why it's necessary. First of all, let's just make sure it makes sense. Okay, here is yet again, systemic capillary. Here are these contracting muscle fibers. Okay. There's oxygenated blood traveling through the systemic capillary. What does oxygenated blood look like? Okay, oxygenated blood has a partial pressure of oxygen within its blood plasma of about 100 millimeters of mercury. Okay, so that would typically mean that if oxygenated blood has a partial pressure of oxygen within its blood plasma, that means, this is a conversation that we had extensively throughout these lectures, that means that hemoglobin within the blood is about 100% saturated with oxygen. Okay, now, as the oxygenated blood travels through the systemic capillary, the partial pressure of oxygen within its blood plasma falls to about 40, which is the same as the partial pressure of oxygen within the interstitial fluid around the contracting muscle fibers. Normally, if the partial pressure of oxygen within the blood plasma of this blood falls to 40 millimeters of mercury, that will cause hemoglobin to unload, like, again, 25% of its oxygen. It'll become 75% saturated, right? That's normal, okay? That oxygen goes into the contracting muscles, great, they get to consume it. Okay, but we're actually engaged in physical activity right now, and the body's hot and acidic, and that causes the hemoglobin dissociation curve, we can draw in red, to shift to the right. Okay, it shifts to the right. What does that mean? Everything will play out exactly the same. It's actually a little bit different than more or less, everything plays out exactly the same. What the difference is that when you actually are engaged in physical activity, the partial pressure of oxygen within the interstitial fluid actually drops even more because the cells consume it more. But understanding that won't help you conceptualize this to any greater degree. Okay, so that was what was going through my head when I said that. So anyways, what's going to happen during physical activity is the same exact process is more or less going to play out. As the oxygenated blood, change this back to black, as this oxygenated blood travels through this systemic capillary, the partial pressure of oxygen within the blood will fall to, let's say, 40, right? That's the same as the partial pressure of oxygen within the interstitial fluid. Okay. But the hemoglobin dissociation curve has shifted to the right because you are currently hot and acidic due to engaging in physical activity for the reasons that we discussed. Okay, so the hemoglobin dissociation curve has shifted to the right. Now, the partial pressure of oxygen within the blood plasma is still 40, but the hemoglobin dissociation curve has shifted to the right. And that means if the partial pressure of oxygen within the blood plasma is 40, which is what it normally is as it travels through the systemic capillary, but the body is hot and acidic due to physical activity and the hemoglobin dissociation curve has shifted to the right, that means at a partial pressure of oxygen of 40 within the blood plasma, hemoglobin will unload 50% of its oxygen and become 50% saturated rather than what it normally does, which is unload 25% of its oxygen and become 75% saturated. Another way of saying this is when you're hot and acidic, hemoglobin unloads way more oxygen into the cells or tissues of your body. I can say this a million different ways. When you're hot and acidic, hemoglobin will unload more oxygen at a given partial pressure of oxygen within the blood plasma compared to what it normally does. Right? Normally, at a partial pressure of oxygen within the blood plasma, hemoglobin would unload 25% of its oxygen, but when you're hot and acidic, hemoglobin at a partial pressure of oxygen within the blood plasma of 40 will unload 50% of its oxygen. Again, you can just say that at a given partial pressure, hemoglobin will unload more oxygen when the body is hot and acidic. That means that the hemoglobin dissociation curve has shifted, again, I can draw it in red here, to the right. That's always what it means. And what would be the benefit of this? Well, what do the muscle cells need more of? The muscle cells need more oxygen, right? To make more ATP through oxidative phosphorylation, right? The muscle cells are contracting. Through that increased level of contraction, they're consuming more ATP. Thus, they need to make more ATP. Thus, to make more ATP, they need more oxygen to make the ATP through oxidative phosphorylation. So when the body is hot and acidic during physical activity, hemoglobin will release more oxygen into the cells, the tissues, than it normally would at a given partial pressure. And that provides more oxygen to the contracting muscle cells that need that extra oxygen to make more ATP through oxidative phosphorylation to meet their ATP demands. This is what it means when the hemoglobin dissociation curve shifts to the right when the body is hot and acidic. It just means that at a given partial pressure of oxygen within the blood plasma, hemoglobin will unload more oxygen than it normally would. Okay. That's incredibly important because the cells need more oxygen. Right? During physical activity, they need more oxygen so they can make more ATP through oxidative phosphorylation, right? It all kind of makes sense. I can promise you if you continue on with any clinical path, the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve will come back a million times. Sometimes you look at how it shifts to the left when the body becomes alkaline, for example. That's not something I'm going to do with you. We're already way out of time. Okay, so it doesn't matter which direction somebody tells you that it shifts in the future. It doesn't matter what somebody tells you about the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve in the future. I hope that by going through this, you understand the fundamentals of it, and no matter what you hear about it, it makes, hopefully a decent amount of sense. So that concludes our discussion of gas exchange, and that concludes our whole discussion of the respiratory system for that matter. So the respiratory system, just like so many other systems in the human body, is truly amazing and unbelievably complex. I hope at the end of this, you have a basic appreciation for how amazing and complex the respiratory system is. And I'll add in, we do this with every system, but we're only scratching the surface of the respiratory system in these conversations, in these lectures. There's almost an infinite more amount of material that could be discussed with regard to the respiratory system and its regulation and just so many other aspects that we don't ever get to.